Okay, well, we've got a bit to get through this afternoon, so we might kick off, and obviously, as people continue to join, they can hopefully catch up. To introduce myself, my name's Karina Dowling. I'm a practice leader at Citation Legal, based in Melbourne. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, Better Bargaining: Preparing for Your Next Enterprise Agreement. Just before we kick off today's discussion, and if you haven't joined us before, I just want to take a minute to introduce Citation Group and give you a little bit of background about who we are and how we support Australian business. Our history goes back about 35 years. We originated as a specialist employment law firm, and over the years, we have continued to grow and evolve, looking at how we can help solve more challenges that Australian businesses are facing. So we've expanded into technology, launching our own HRIS and safety software, and also certification, where citation certification, we're very proud to say, is now Australia's second largest certified accredited body for ISO standards. We've also grown our HR and workplace safety outsourcing capabilities, and most recently, we welcomed the team at Found You into the group, which brings payroll and workforce management capabilities into our organisation, and hundreds of clients with them. So while we have continued to grow and evolve over the years, we have maintained our underlying purpose, which is to help Australian businesses manage their people, their compliance, and their risk as they grow. Today's session is, of course, focused on Citation Legal and the employment law arm of Citation Group, and where the business first began is the core of what we do. And our team of employment lawyers work closely with businesses to provide strategic legal advice across the full spectrum of workplace laws. Our role isn't just about providing advice when issues arise. We're very proud to say that we work alongside our clients more as partners to help them understand their obligations, manage their risk, and make confident decisions in relation to their people and their business. Enterprise bargaining is certainly an area where that expertise is particularly important, particularly given the changes in this area over the years. And the number of employers that are finding themselves at the bargaining table now, sometimes not by choice. So today I am joined by my colleague Michael Rutek, who is a partner in our Sydney office, and together we're going to take you through some of the key focuses of enterprise bargaining and what they mean for you as employers, and importantly, if this is something that you are considering engaging in or you might be forced to engage in, how you can prepare for that process. So hopefully at the end of this, you'll take away some practical tips and tricks to go back to the office and start putting some plans into place. There is an option to pop some questions into the chat bar, so please, if you have any questions, feel free to pop those in. We do have a lot to get through this afternoon. We'll get through as many questions if we can, and of course you'll have our contact details, so if there's anything that you require assistance with, whether it be enterprise bargaining or otherwise, you can reach out to our team. So on that note, very broadly speaking, I'm going to run through an overview of the framework of bargaining, and then I'll hand over to Michael to go through sort of the more meatier aspects of what bargaining for an enterprise agreement looks like. Some of you are going to be coming to this presentation with potentially some experience. Maybe you've bargained in a previous role and you're just looking for a refresher. For some of you, it might be a completely new concept. So I'll give an overview. Hopefully it's not information that you're already going to be across. Very high level, enterprise bargaining is where an employer and its employees agree to bargain for a new industrial instrument that will apply to those employees instead of a modern award in relation to the terms and conditions of their employment. There's a few ways that you can do that. It can cover your entire business. It can cover a particular group or a particular site, depending on your business needs. There are different types of enterprise agreements as well. The most common is the single enterprise agreement, which is one employer employer making an agreement with its employees, again, whether that's the whole cohort or a select group of the employees. So, of course, we're governed by the Fair Work Act in relation to the bargaining process, what an enterprise agreement needs to include, and the process. And it is quite regulated in terms of the process that you need to follow. So, it is really important that before you sort of dive into this process, you do get some advice about how to ensure that you're going to comply with that. So broadly speaking, there's, I guess, a preferred time frame for when you can start taking steps to prepare for this, what can be a relatively lengthy process. Some employers don't have the benefit of a significant lead time because they might be forced to the bargaining table. So, for example, you might have the union get involved. They can't initiate bargaining, but if they get the majority of your employees to say, yes, we want to bargain, then the Fair Work Commission can issue a majority support determination, and that can force you to the table. Ideally, you won't be forced. You'll be making a business decision to say, look, this is what my business needs. This is how I want to proceed. So if you can, it's ideal to start 12 months out, having a look at what's working in your business, what are the pressure points in the award that you would like to streamline, to change, or to clarify within the document. So really high level, what are you trying to achieve, and costing that out from the very beginning. Then moving into sort of the 6-month period, having a look at what your strategy is, what's the mandate from the team, getting your team together for bargaining, exploring without accidentally kicking off bargaining, what would your employees be looking for in terms of what they would like to see in an agreement. Then having a look, if you do have an existing agreement, check what your nominal expiry date is. So that will be the date in the agreement that says this agreement will expire on this date. Very important to note that your nominal expiry date does not mean that your agreement will actually terminate at that date. It's still an important trigger because it means that once you pass that date, industrial action can be taken by unions. So if your agreement has passed the nominal expiry date, it will continue to operate until such time as it's either formally terminated by the Fair Work Commission or you enter into a new agreement that is approved by the Fair Work Commission. And you also need to remember throughout the life of the agreement, including after the nominal expiry date, that the base rate of pay in your enterprise agreement must always be equal to or greater than the equivalent base rate in the reference award. So while an enterprise agreement will largely replace the applicable award that would otherwise apply, it's with that caveat around your base rates of pay. So you've gone through this process, you've got a plan, you haven't actually commenced bargaining yet. Once you are ready to commence bargaining, then you have to issue what's called, we like to call it the NER, but it's the Notice of Employee Representational Rights, and that is a mouthful, which is why we call it the NER. That must be issued within 14 days of the decision to commence bargaining. So, as I said, if you're going to go through these processes, these earlier processes, sort of sense testing your employees about what the agreement might look like, you need to be very careful that you haven't accidentally kicked off bargaining because the time frame is enforced strictly. You must issue that NER within 14 days. So, high level, once again, the end-to-end view of the bargaining process. So you've kicked it off by issuing the NER. Your employees have the ability to appoint bargaining representatives. So they might, within their own group, nominate who they want to be the essential spokesperson for the group. It's certainly not ideal, depending on the size of your cohort, for every single employee to say, I want to be a bargaining rep, and then you're bargaining with, every man and his dog. So they can appoint bargaining representatives who are the appointed representative for this process. It can be the union. It doesn't have to be. So that's obviously going to depend on if you actually have union involvement in your workplace. If you have staff who are members of the union, then the union will be involved in this process. So you've kicked off the process, you know who the bargaining reps are, then you start bargaining in good faith, and Michael's going to take you through what that actually means. So we move through that process, we reach a point where all parties at the bargaining table are relatively comfortable with what's in that document. Then that goes to an employee vote. If you have a majority approval of the agreement, which is 50% plus one person of the number of people that vote, then that agreement is now approved. However, it is not yet in operation because the Fair Work Commission has the final say in terms of whether it meets all of the regulations of the Fair Work Act, including, you've complied with the process in relation to the NER, the access period, the voting requirements, and that the content of the agreement itself also passes the Better Off Overall test. So once the Commission is satisfied that all of that passes the test, it's compliant, then the agreement will commence operation. And you can specify in the agreement when that operation date will be. It could be 7 days after approval, it might be the first pay period after approval, and you can specify that in the agreement. So, auditing your starting position, again, make sure that you're aware if you have an existing enterprise agreement. Obviously, if you don't, this is not going to be relevant, but make sure you're aware of the nominal expiry date so that you know what your time frame is. And some agreements will actually specify when you have to start bargaining for a new agreement. So if you've bargained previously with a union, it's a very common term that they will say you need to start bargaining with us at least 3 months before the nominal expiry date. So check your terms as well. Start mapping the practice from the EA because that may become a claim. It's really, really helpful, again, if you have an existing enterprise agreement, that throughout the life of it, you're tracking when you get pressure points or there's some ambiguity. It's all well and good, you're putting the document together at the time, you think, yes, this makes sense, I know how this is going to work. And then down the track, there's a scenario where in practice you think, oh, that clause is actually maybe a little bit unclear, or we hadn't anticipated this particular scenario. So track those through the life of the agreement if you can, because this is your opportunity to refresh or clarify those provisions if you need to. And then obviously benchmarking against the award. Your initial agreement, if you've got one, obviously would have gone through that process against the Better Off Overall test initially, but the awards change relatively regularly at the moment, so make sure that you're doing that process as well as you go. Pulling that data early is really, really helpful as well. It makes it a lot harder if you're going to the bargaining table and you don't have a good sense of what your current costs are, if you've got some proposals in mind already, what they're going to cost you. So that preparation piece is going to be really, really helpful to be able to do that before you even reach the bargaining table. Going back to the NER just briefly, and I don't mean to harp on it, but it is a very important part of the process. And there have been a number of cases over time where an agreement has actually been rejected by the Fair Work Commission simply because of essentially an administrative error going back to the issuing of the NERR. So it is an administrative process, but defects can unravel the whole thing regardless of whether your employees have voted up the agreement or not. So some key things to remember about the NER. It is strict in its form. So there is a template that has been issued and there is very little scope for adjusting it. The only thing you need to insert in there is essentially the name of the business, the proposed name of the title of the enterprise agreement, and who the agreement proposed to cover. If you alter any of the balance of the template, then you risk the Commission saying that is non-compliant. This whole process needs to start again. So do not make any amendments to that document other than where there's a clear field for you to insert information. And I would go to the point of do not put it on your letterhead. Do not attach other documents. It is a standalone document to be issued as is to the employees who are going to be covered by that agreement. And again, the timing is strict. So be very cautious with your pre-commencement communications, making sure you haven't accidentally tripped or triggered bargaining. And once you have made that final determination to commence the process, that 14 days is considered a strict time frame. Make sure you do name the correct entity in that document as well. The only sort of flexibility that we know that the Commission is prepared to allow in relation to the NER is if you end up changing the title of the enterprise agreement. So you're not necessarily committed to that. But again, I would avoid that if you can as well. So from the kicking off stage to explaining the agreement moving to approval. So once you've got sort of the proposed agreement that you're going to send off for a vote, you need to provide the employees with that, remembering that not every employee was at the bargaining table, so they're not necessarily going to know what sort of happened. So you need to take reasonable steps to explain the agreement and the effect of it to employees. So we usually recommend having some information sessions, having a few of those, especially if you've got sort of a workforce working different hours. And taking into account whether you need to make any accommodations for people who have English as a second language or require any other assistance to understand what the document is. There are also strict requirements in terms of the access period that the employees need to have so that there's sufficient time to have those discussions and for them to consider it. So you've gone through that, what's called the access period, you've explained it to your staff, you conduct a ballot, and there's a few different ways that you can do it. It can be the sort of old school, you get a written piece of paper with yes or no on it. It's anonymous, but you do have to track who has had the opportunity to vote. So you'll need to mark off this person voted. I gave them their ballot. You don't see the ballot, they don't write their name on it. If you get 50% plus one, then the agreement is made. And you then have 14 days to lodge that with the Fair Work Commission, along with a statutory declaration, which confirms the process that was undertaken to say that, yes, we've complied with the various administrative requirements. And then the Fair Work Commission is going to conduct the BOOT, which is the Better Off Overall test. So that's where they essentially line by line go through and compare the EA with the award to make sure that employees are going to be better off overall. So it's, obviously there are going to be some cases where maybe an entitlement, say an allowance has been removed. You can do that so long as that has been compensated in some other way. Word on the street is that the Commission is actually using AI, which is interesting, to conduct these boot assessments. So I'm not sure that the details of that, but presumably they're feeding in proposed EAs and asking AI to compare it to the reference award. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So on that note, again, it's very, very high level and some questions have come through and we'll answer those at the end. But now to sort of get into the meat of the bargaining phase, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Michael.
Thank you, Karina. Appreciate that. And I also appreciate that there's a lot of information there that we could probably spend half a day talking about as well. And we do have two comments or questions that have come through. Please don't hesitate to put questions in the Q&A box. So when we are bargaining, and I'm going to move through this at a reasonable rate, we basically need to identify who is going to have the authority to be the person at the table, who is there, who is going to take notes, and ensure that there aren't too many people involved in that process. So I can see a number of people in the attendees list who I've spoken to about this already, and some of them have already participated in bargaining processes and currently doing it in matters that we're involved in. But you just need to know who that person is. I was involved in a bargaining table negotiation earlier this year where it was myself, the industrial relations leader and their offsider, so 3 of us, and then there were 3 union reps. To answer one of the questions from Fatima in the chat, it says, what happens when you have a union representing staff in the EBA process, and additionally an employee wants to represent themselves in the bargaining process and they don't want to be represented by the union? Happens all the time, usually in larger bargaining processes where an employee has historically participated or just wants to know how it works. They can be nominated, they can nominate themselves, and they have every right to be there. So I guess who is going to be there from the company is generally something to determine quite quickly, not to have too many people and crowd out the room, but also to administratively be able to take notes, keep minutes. Before you get to the table, you want to have what at the very beginning, what's our log of claims? You might have submitted that. That's a document which is, something that an employer might put together to say that this is what we want to achieve. The union might do the same, the employees might do the same. And then you move through that and you might create what's called a claims matrix where you tick them off as you go along. And the proposal is brought to the table, people consider it. There might be broad acceptance, there might not be, there might be more information that you need before you can agree or disagree or have a position. So that is important. And I think the last box there, cost every claim, very important. No use an employer sort of having a vibe on what might be acceptable or not acceptable. You need to go to your finance team if you're a large enough organisation and cost out what is 2% wage increase, what is 3% wage increase, what is a 4%, what is doing that, and then tinkering with the allowances mean. And so quite often employers might strategically wait until the last moment to say, well, we've secured what we believe our wage position is. That means we can then talk about, the cost that all of these allowances are. And, you can strategically respond to, if a union wants a particular claim in there, you can say, well, okay, if that's your position, thank you. We'll consider that as part of our broader look at what the wage increase might look like. So you can sort of control the flow or the pace of the bargaining process in that sense. But you should have done the homework before you enter that room in terms of what each claim will cost. If you can move to the next slide. So generally, 2026, what are we seeing? Well, obviously, we always see people talking about what their wages are going to be. That's not a 2026 issue. That's what humans want to know. And so it's never probably been more important with the way the world is and inflation and everything else. People obviously want and obviously position themselves in, okay, well, what is the consumer price index saying? But they're also moving into a world where pay equity is obviously critical to some people's experiences at work. I think it's quite important personally, but that's sometimes being reduced to terms in enterprise agreements. Flexible work, again, very much in the zeitgeist. So people want to know that they have the right or the employer has the obligation to allow them to work from home if that's possible. We don't necessarily believe that it's always in the employer's best interest to enshrine some way of working from home in an enterprise agreement, but doesn't prevent people from suggesting that that's something that they would like to have. Obviously, the National Employment Standards provides all of that, and there's a whole regime for requests for flexible work arrangements and others things that flow out of that. So, quite often it's already available to them. They just have to exercise it in a different way. And that's a fairly cogent way of responding. Span of hours, overtime treatment, shift arrangements, they never go out of fashion. Classifications and career progression and people wanting to move through and have a career, obviously important in a high inflation environment. So we're seeing people with a real focus on moving through what does it mean if I stick around for the life of the agreement? And also there's a heightened focus on labour hire, obviously with the same job, same pay changes that have occurred and flowed through. You've seen some pretty interesting, pretty massive increases to people's terms and conditions where they're employed by labour hire. but they work alongside agreement-covered employees that get paid more. So, the unions have an interest in regulating how the employer uses labour hire, and they obviously want terms and conditions put in there about when they will use that and when they will use contractors. And obviously, with the rise of AI, people are interested in redundancy terms as well. So that's there, and obviously, casual conversion is and remains an issue people are interested in. So, what is bargaining in good faith? Bargaining in good faith is a regulated part of what bargaining must have. And it doesn't require people to necessarily speak nicely to each other. Bargaining can be vigorous. Bargaining doesn't require anyone to agree with a particular claim, but there are certain things that employers and bargaining reps more generally must do. They must have meetings on a reasonably regular basis, that is, bargaining meetings. They must disclose relevant information that's relevant to a claim in a timely way and not sort of sit on it. They must respond to proposals in a timely way. That again doesn't mean that we have to agree with proposals. It just means that if a claim is made by a union or a bargaining rep employee, we have to have a position on we're considering it. If there's a reason why we can't say yes or no at that particular moment, we should tell them what it is. But we should give, as part of that, and in a related sense, give genuine consideration to those proposals. So that I guess is generally where historically, at least, employers may have sat on their hands a little bit and made it look like they were doing lots of things, but didn't actually give active consideration to things, and sort of suggested that we're waiting for finance to come back to us, or we're waiting for some certainty on what we can actually provide, and we're bargaining, but we don't have the authority to make any decisions. Things like that. So that can sometimes be ways to respond, and there are some other new advents in the Fair Work Act which deal with intractable bargaining and bargaining conferences, which tend to move those discussions along, reasonably promptly once someone pulls that card. So generally, and just quickly, refraining from capricious conduct. So that is stuff that undermines bargaining. Let's have a bargaining meeting. Let's call it off. I'm not talking to you. I don't like you anymore. You didn't speak nicely to me. Engaging in conduct that isn't fair or reasonable in the process of bargaining. That can cut both ways. You sometimes get certain unions behaving like so-and-sos, but that's not to say that employers don't do it as well. So if we have concerns about one party not bargaining in good faith, what happens is a letter or something in writing, could be an email, can come across saying we hold concerns that bargaining isn't happening in good faith. And if that is not sort of resolved, or in the view of the bargaining rep that raised the issues isn't something that's moved that position anywhere, then they can go to the Fair Work Commission once they've done that and they've provided a reasonable amount of time for those concerns to be raised or dealt with. And practically speaking, what happens? The Fair Work Commission arranges a conference and everyone gets around and talks about what the problems are. And then the commission may make an order which says, the employer must hold meetings for the next 3 weeks on these dates, or they must produce the information that sits behind what they say the problem is, those sorts of things. Or at least they must, attend and give genuine consideration to something, rather than acting in a way that undermines bargaining. If you could move to the next slide, please. So a bit of repetition here, but what does it mean in practice? Attending meetings, responding to every claim in writing in good time, disclosing information that's relevant to bargaining, explaining what the position is and why it might be a no, keeping records of every meeting and proposal exchange. So generally speaking, you'll have minutes of bargaining. You'll probably have a claims matrix, and you'll be updating that document. And if the employer owns that, then they really drive the whole process. So be organised, be ready to produce, those documents, and then the agenda for the next meeting flows. Don't refuse to bargain. That might sound simple, but once bargaining has commenced, you've issued a NER. You have every right. You have the obligation, I should say, to bargain. You should not. Obviously, where people are sick or unwell, or as things happen, or there's a busy period at work, that can often be valid reasons not to meet for the next 3 weeks. Sometimes it's Christmas. Sometimes, things happen. Let's say it's an agricultural business, harvest is on, something like that gets in the way. Those are all sensible reasons. But just, suggesting that, we've had enough, you can go sit in the corner for 4 weeks and we won't talk to you. And then we might agree, if you're lucky, if you speak nicely to us, to have a meeting 5 weeks from now. That sort of stuff is capricious. That would unfairly delay it. And I guess the last bit, bypassing bargaining reps and pressuring employees directly. Fine line between doing that and just simply keeping your employees updated, which is very, very good practice. You might, after each bargaining meeting or at certain points each month, just provide an update on, how it's going at a high level to your employees. Because in the absence of providing information, the employees really only have it from the union, and you aren't trusted through the process. So that's quite important. Update people on the passage of bargaining, how many meetings we've had, who's attended, and those sorts of things. They don't cost anyone anything, but they give people the feeling that they're an active participant, even if they're not bargaining. If you could move to the next slide. So on the screen, we've got what happens when bargaining disputes arise and the types of orders that the Fair Work Commission can make. So I touched on good faith bargaining before and talked about the orders that the Commission can make. Very practically speaking, you must meet for the next 3 Wednesdays at 12 o'clock in this agreed place. And that can really make people keep bargaining. The other ways that bargaining can stall is if the parties just aren't, something's not working short of there being good faith bargaining issues. The people in the room aren't progressing it because they're unskilled or because they can't talk to each other. They've sort of personal differences in between. The Commission can actually become involved via a Section 240 conference, which is just simply sitting down in a room and trying to move through a process with the Fair Work Commission's assistance. They like doing that. And in my experience, it's actually been quite good, where, maybe you're negotiating with 4 unions or more than one, and it's the union side of the picture just can't organise themselves appropriately. They don't know who's really in charge of the process from their perspective, and they can't agree, and then they can't, consider claims. Scope orders happen when the union typically alleges that a group of employees that you're seeking to bargain with are the wrong group and should be a bigger group or a smaller group, on the basis that they're not geographically, organisationally, or operationally distinct. So, in a practical sense, it might be all of the employees in the maintenance crew that you want to bargain with. But actually, the union says, well, if we're doing that, we may as well deal with the production people as well. Or we might deal with 3 sites instead of just the one. And so, that's where a dispute might arise. They might suggest that it should be a broader group or a smaller group, and we have to describe why they are geographically, operationally, or organisationally distinct, and that the Commission will tell us who to bargain with if we can't agree between ourselves. Where predicted industrial action happens, in essence, there's a whole process for that. It can only happen during bargaining. It can't happen during the life of the agreement. The Commission must receive an application from a union, typically, where, if it's employee claim action, that is, the union wants to take its members out on strike, they have to satisfy a range of administrative processes. There's a vote which happens once the Commission makes an order for a protected action ballot order, and then there's a vote that happens, and if that's approved, which typically it is, then the employees can go out on strike who are union members. Um, and then a new feature, which is what is there to resolve bargaining where it doesn't progress in any meaningful sense. After 9 months, the a bargaining rep may apply to the Fair Work Commission to actually arbitrate the terms of the enterprise agreement. So quite often employers would stall the process. Big mining companies would stall the process for years at a time and say, look, we're doing this, we're doing that. Look over here. As one of the clients says, I'm not sure if she's here today, jazz hands and distract everyone. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. And beyond having problems with bargaining orders, in terms of good faith bargaining orders, intractable bargaining is now there to resolve those blockages. So after 9 months, the Commission can actually get the parties to submit evidence as to why they support or don't support particular claims, and the Commission will actually just choose whether it goes into the enterprise agreement or not. So fairly direct involvement there by the Fair Work Commission. So again, could do a presentation on each of those items, which would go for half a day, but at a very high level, that's what it's all about. Practical tips. So as I've said, it's important to document every meeting, the attendees, the claims, the responses, and control that information and make sure that we're not losing anything. If you do lose something, it might lead a clever union to suggest that you're not bargaining in good faith. You want to be organised. You want to know what you've agreed to, what you haven't agreed to, what you're still working on. And I think that's just a smart and an experienced and a strategically able employer is controlling that process. They know, and the union might trip and fall over and try to start bargaining on something that they've previously said yes or no to or whatever. But if you sit there and say, well, we talked about that in bargaining meeting 2, we responded this way, you said this, and then it fell away. That can be quite persuasive when you're dealing with some of the more contentious things you're actually looking to achieve. And then, yes, you want to have typically one person or two people, or at least the company line being consistent at the bargaining table through the process. Where you don't have that consistency, you probably don't have control. You might leave yourself open for there, being an allegation that you're acting in a way that doesn't accord with the good faith bargaining obligations. But also, you might become disorganized, disorientated, and agree or disagree with something you've previously, said the opposite thing to. So you really just want to, follow through with a reasonable level of consistency. And as we always say, I think going to lawyers or experts, if you need to, is a good idea, and that can be whether if there's an interlocutory kind of bargaining dispute issue, or even at the beginning, if you want to sort of map out the process and conduct the boot before you get started and work on your log of claims and procedural elements. Or increasingly, I mean, we've got 2 or 3 bargaining projects at the moment where some of our lawyers are the bargaining reps. So, where you've got legacy items you want to get rid of, let's say it's your 6 enterprise agreements deep, and 25 years ago some people put in some fairly special arrangements for certain employees, and you want to sort of get rid of those. You might need to do a fair bit of homework to work out, okay, how are we actually going to get this out of the agreement, and what are we going to give away to achieve that, and how are we going to do that, how are we going to map that out. So that's always helpful. And obviously, if there's a protected action ballot order application that is to go out on strike, there are some fairly compressed timeframes that the Commission has to deal with that very promptly. There's the need to for that to be approved very, very quickly. There's very limited scope to object to the making of that protected action ballot order. That is, that there was some deficiency in it. So you need to move quickly. If you raise an objection, there will be a hearing. Are you ready for the hearing? All of those things are live issues that are short space of time. And when people are taking protected industrial action, that's very disruptive. And there are some very prescribed rules about, how we pay people during the taking of protected industrial action. Is it a partial work ban? Can we dock them a small amount of pay because of the way that they're taking their protected industrial action that's only part of their duties. And how do we provide notice that we're going to do that? Responding to claims in a timely way, we've talked about that. Modelling every claim against the boot before you respond. So I guess that's, how does this fit into the bigger picture in terms of the boot? And you want to cost every claim before you respond. That really starts sometimes before bargaining, but you want to get the cost of, what 1%, 2%, what does that allowance cost? All of that in there. And the last one is a very important one, and that is just communicating, because through the employment, the bargaining life cycle, bargaining is disruptive, and employees sort of fall into camps during bargaining. Some develop a bit of a hatred for their employer in that period, and then you slowly earn it back over the life of the agreement, and then you lose it again. And so you really don't want to cause that to develop too greatly, and you really want to communicate with people through the bargaining process. And so that starts actually beforehand, as Karina said. We are going to start bargaining soon. We sort of want to do a survey. How are you going? What and consider those issues. You might suggest, rather than doing a survey, that you want to make noises that you're genuinely here to listen. And then you move into the process. You keep people updated throughout, and then what's really important to know, and I think it's a really important message, is the bargaining table dynamic is important, but what's more important than that is knowing that of the people who are the relevant employees who will be covered by it, who's going to vote yes and who's going to vote no, and they're not at the bargaining table. So you can have a major disagreement with all of your bargaining reps, but if you put the agreement out to vote, you might find that the broader cohort actually like the look of it and vote yes. And that ends that whole bargaining process once the agreement is made. That is, the majority of employees who are able to cast a vote do so, and it's a yes. The majority of those is a yes. So that I guess is a really important concept. Have we? Yes. Okay. So we've got a couple of minutes left. We've got 10 questions. So we might try to answer some of those. I've answered Fatima's question. An anonymous attendee asked, how should we conduct the Better Off Overall test for an employee who does not have a fixed work pattern or regular roster, if their hours vary, et cetera, in terms of the boot? So in the process where you submit it to the Fair Work Commission, they will actually ask a whole range of questions about certain terms and conditions. And if you don't have employees who work in that way, you can simply tell them, and that you don't need to provide an undertaking. But you should consider, if you're an employer with busy periods, like I said, with agriculture in harvest, or you're busily producing food around the Christmas time, or there are peaks and troughs, or there's the requirement to do lots of maintenance and on night shift at a particular part of the year, then you need to sort of consider that. You need to consider set-off provisions. You need to consider in employment contracts, but you also need to consider the balance of the terms and conditions in that period. So they're all part of the considerations, if I can put it that way. The next question I've got on my screen is, I was recently told a NER was not a legal requirement by a business, only a letter was needed. Is this correct? I have to say that is profoundly not correct. And you do need a NER. You need to issue that to commence bargaining. It basically provides notice to the employees of their right to be represented. That is an important process. And the reason that it is important is because the Commission wants to know that anyone who was voting knew that they had the right to be represented, or could represent themselves, or that the union could be their person in that process. And it's an important democratic idea. So you definitely need a NER, and you definitely need to comply with the obligations as well. We are conducting, the next question, boot assessments for duty managers who don't have fixed work patterns. They are paid above the award, some at 20%, some at 50% above the base rate. Because their shifts can vary across weekdays, weekends, public holidays, what's the best way to perform the boot? Should we create multiple reasonably foreseeable roster patterns? Disease roster pattern needs to pass the boot. Yeah, I mean, you can, I think that would be an exceptionally strong way to proceed. Oftentimes when we are asked to conduct a boot, We generally are asked to do it on the basis of what are the terms and conditions in there. If there is the need to look at rates from the perspective of roster patterns, it's obviously much more involved, and it obviously has a bit of a cost impact as well for engaging solicitors. But it is an incredibly fastidious way to ensure that you pass the boot. Generally speaking, the Commission will concern itself with the balance of the terms and conditions and ensuring that at least the base rate of pay is higher. And it might ask you some curly questions in relation to, people working on a Sunday at 3 a.m., that kind of thing. But it is, generally speaking, if you've done all of that homework and you've determined that the employees are better off, then you won't have any concerns whatsoever in relation to that as you move along. Should an employer approach the union to commence bargaining or wait for the union to approach the employer? Well, Jenny, that's a really good question. If you have an enterprise agreement already, the nominal expiry date arrives, and you don't need to commence bargaining unless you want to. But there are ways for the union to bring you to the bargaining table. If you want to commence bargaining, then you can issue the NER. You can, if you want to, get in contact with the union. If they're already a party to the agreement, you should. Generally speaking, if the employer wants to commence bargaining, it starts with the NER, and then you might get in contact with the union. But, typically speaking, depending on if you have union involvement in your workplace, the issuing of the NER might lead to one of their members contacting the union. You do not need to proactively contact whoever you think might be the relevant union if you want to commence bargaining. And that's a really important point. There are many, many agreements that don't have any union involvement whatsoever, and it's not a legal requirement to have that. It's only if you issue a NER and somebody sticks their hand up and says, well, I'm actually a member, I've contacted my union has standing to be there.
There's one more that I'll quickly touch on. There's one more from Beth. After bargaining has commenced, can the union add more claims further into bargaining? They're not prohibited from doing that. Ordinarily, if you're bargaining with a union, they will generally come to you with their log of claims to start with. And look, in my experience, that log will almost always include ambit claims, things that they have no intention of or that they know won't be agreed. But the process of bargaining itself does contemplate that there will be movement on both sides, and that may be introducing new claims or altered claims based on the bargaining process. I think there's definitely a risk that if one party or one bargaining rep is continually moving the goalposts without a particular justification and frustrating the process, then they might land themselves in hot water in relation to whether that is in fact good faith bargaining. But broadly speaking, yes, the claims can evolve throughout the process of bargaining. So I hope that answers the question for Beth. As Michael said, we have run over a little bit this afternoon, and we could otherwise keep talking for hours and hours about enterprise bargaining, but hopefully you've gotten some pointers to take away. You can obviously reach out to Citation Legal if we can be of any assistance in your businesses, whether it's in relation to enterprise agreements or any other workplace issues more broadly. You can get some information if you can grab the QR link on the screen as well. We'll give you some more details about that. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to have you on one of our webinars again in the future.
Take care, guys.